Elbaf has become Hellbaf, as anything the human mind is capable of imagining is coming into existence on this island. And the reason why this is happening is because conjuring nightmares is now the only way of combating Luffy's ability to tangibly manifest his dreams and imagination. One Piece has well and truly left the realm of what once passed for reality, but the future of Elbaf, and in fact the future of the world, isn't just in Luffy's hands, and Elbaf is going to be the first of many islands to experience an awakening, and before this arc is over, we could see an army of giant sun gods. Late stage One Piece has very much become a fight on the battleground of dreams. Although the entire premise of the series has always been a dream, it's even quite literally stated in the opening of almost every episode. Wealth, fame, power. Gold Roger, the king of the pirates, attained this and everything else the world has to offer, and his dying words drove countless men to the seas. You want my treasure? You can have it. I left everything gathered together in one place. Now you just have to find it. These words lured men to the Grand Line in pursuit of dreams greater than they'd ever dared to imagine. And some of those men and not men are the Straw Hats, with each of them having their own dreams, such as becoming the Pirate King, drawing a map of the world, curing all disease, finally seeing some panties after almost a century of asking politely, and so on and so forth. Our protagonists all have these wildly ambitious dreams to achieve, as does almost everyone who we meet along the way. Kobe wants to become a Marine Admiral, Sambo wants to become an author, and Hard-chan wants to start a cannibalistic takoyaki stand. And everyone closely connected to the ancient Great Kingdom has even bigger ambitions. The fishermen dream of living on the surface, the people of Wano want to open the borders, the minks are waiting for the dawn of the world, and also our antagonists even dream. Which is why One Piece has a focus on what I call dream combat, which is why Luffy doesn't kill his opponents. He instead shatters their dreams and ambitions, leaving them without the will remaining to be pricks anymore, at least for the most part. And really, Luffy tends to fight two kinds of people: those who dream and those who have dreamed but said dreams have been shattered. Most pre-time skip antagonists fall into that latter bucket. Luffy faces off against a lot of individuals who have tried and failed, like Kuro, Don Krieg, Arlong, Crocodile, and Gecko Moria, although there are a couple who dream big like NL and Spandam, as well as some who have never dreamed at all and have accepted their place as a function of society, such as Rob Lucci. Either way, pre-time skip, what Luffy was coming up against most was wall after wall of denial. He was facing off against those who have failed or those who had never tried and therefore could not accept that Luffy could succeed either. However, post-time skip is a very different beast altogether, because in the new world, dreaming is a prerequisite for survival. You cannot make your way through this sea without that strong mentality. And so Luffy has now been fighting directly against antagonists who are trying to manifest their own dreams, however nightmarish they may be. We're talking people like Hody Jones, Caesar Clown, Doflamingo, Bigagamam, Kaido, and even Damalo Black, the fake Luffy who had a dream of entering and conquering the new world. And that's before we mention the truly heavy hitters who we still have yet to defeat, such as Blackbeard and Sakazuki, who both have the horrifying capacity to render their dreams into reality, which to many would be more accurately referred to as nightmares. And the very nature of the One Piece world itself is kind of like a dream, in that it makes sense in the context of the dream, but not when you try to talk about it while you're awake. Because how do you explain a dream that contains giant zombies, dinosaurs, cyborgs, secret agents, mermaids, cake islands, men in boxes, and men in chicken butts? You can't. It just doesn't make sense. One Piece is a dream. But with dreams also comes the existence of nightmares. Oda created the Grand Line and the New World as an opposing force to hope. The despair of this impossibly chaotic sea is meant to be a direct challenge, to meet impossibly high dreams with an equally as tough obstacle, and he said that he created this space to shock both the characters and the audience. So One Piece is a half dream, half nightmare being brought into existence by Eiichiro Oda. However, in the final saga, we've taken this concept a big step further. And now dream power is quite tangible and shockingly literal. The idea of manifesting one's dreams isn't just to push and take small steps towards achieving a tangible goal. No, now we have Luffy's power in Gear 5th. Luffy at his most liberated, with his imagination completely uninhibited, free to do what I think is quite literally anything he wants to do. In his Gear 5th form, Luffy is a living dream. If he can imagine it, then it becomes real. And it's also a power that he's passing on to those around him, like some sort of dreamer's disease. A disease caught by one Jewelry Bonnie, which is appropriate, because her entire childhood was characterized by a disease called sapphire scales, a nightmarish condition conjured from the mind of actual demon St. J. Garcia Saturn. And that right there is the other side of introducing dreaming as a tangible unmatchable power source. It has to come with an opposing force for the sake of tension. Otherwise, One Piece would drop drama altogether and just become a gag manga. But just like how Eiichiro Oda created the Grand Line as an opposing nightmarish force to challenge the dreams of his characters, in the final saga, the idea of literally manifesting nightmares has become terrifyingly real through multiple different vehicles. Most recently, the Holy Knights have shown their capacity to put children to sleep and bring their worst fears into reality, whether that be a Fenrir, a Jormungandr, a Loki, this kid's mum, or even the fear of the sun god himself. What we are dealing with on Elbaf is a challenge based in hypotheticals rather than any sort of fictional reality, which is usually where our protagonists excel. Remember that pre-time skip, our characters constantly ran into wall after wall of boring reality that they had to demolish through the sheer willpower of dreaming. And it's that power that's being used against us in the final saga, which I think is perfectly demonstrated in the examples of both Loki and Nika, because they do exist in reality, but we're not fighting against what it is they actually are. We're going up against the worst case scenario perception of what Nika and Loki are capable of, with one being prophesized to destroy the world and the other who has been self-prophesized to also destroy the world. Nika is understandable because there's a lot of history attached to the sun god, and it is quite historically unclear whether he's a figure that we should embrace or fear. Loki, however, is a modern legend of Elbaf, and it's very possible that what we're seeing of his nightmare conjuration is exactly what Loki was trying to portray himself as. If for whatever reason his destroy the world attitude is all an act to protect Elbaf, what his nightmare incarnation shows is how successful he's been in conjuring and maintaining that act. And perhaps the choice that Loki himself will have to make during Elbaf is whether he chooses the path of dream or nightmare. The nightmare theme isn't new to Elbaf though, and Oda explored this quite thoroughly on Egghead Island through Jewelry Bonnie. Saint Saturn was her nightmare. He experimented on Bonnie's mother, butchered her father, and pursued her all the way to this point as a giant demonic spider. And so Bonnie's challenge on Egghead Island was to overcome that nightmare through the hope of dreaming, and also to become liberated from a nightmare imposed on her by someone else. And if you weren't reading weekly at the time, Bonnie being able to use her devil fruit to achieve the Gear 5th Nika form did generate some criticism from those who claimed that it cheapened Luffy's achievement to have the form accessed by a 12-year-old girl. But the point of Oda doing this was less about transforming and power and punching, but more about showing that Bonnie was finally free of her lifelong nightmare. And I think that a similar thing could be about to happen on Elbaf, which I imagine would generate similar controversy, because I'm not sure if these nightmare creatures can be fought and destroyed through the efforts of real-life willpower alone, because that's not usually how nightmares work. Just like dreams, nightmares are usually illogical, like the classic one of being chased and you're trying to get away but your legs, they just won't move. Why legs? Why are you doing this? Or trying to flee through a small space that gets progressively more narrow until you get stuck? Or suddenly being naked in public? Nightmares are not logical, and so they could have access to the same Toon-esque abilities that Luffy has, which would be the answer to how an opponent successfully combats Luffy from here on out. I love Gear 5th, but it's a very risky ability to balance, as no opponent since Luffy having achieved this form has been able to give him a serious challenge. And I very much include Kaido in that. After Gear 5th was activated, Kaido fought and fought. He hit and he hit, and he even became a giant scary fire dragon, but in the end, nothing even came close to breaking Luffy's liberation. It was extremely one-sided, but well choreographed and very fun to read one-sided, because Kaido was not equipped to deal with Luffy. And that makes sense because he's a very reality-based man. He had the title of World's Strongest Creature, which, yeah, it's probably true, but when you have a title that defined, it grounds you in the reality of that title. It doesn't allow you to have the belief that you can push further because you're already the strongest. There's nowhere left to go, which is why Kaido was often seen drinking in despair and had a hobby of seeing if he could remove himself from the world because there was no dream to move towards. In the end, Kaido settled for a goal of starting the biggest war that the world has ever known, but that feels like more of a resignation than it does a goal. The idea that this world has nothing left to offer, so I may as well just get rid of it. But children don't have that level of despair. They have yet to grow up, experience the ceilings of the world, and give in to them, which is what makes using the nightmares of the children of Elbaf extremely effective. Because what can any adult do? All of the adults are too grounded in reality reality to defeat creatures that aren't subject to the rules of reality, which is why I think that it may be up to the children of Elbaf themselves to ultimately save the island. Just as it was up to Jewelry Bonnie to free herself from the nightmare of Saint Saturn. Yes, Luffy was there to help and inspire her, just as he will be there to help and inspire the children of Elbaf, who actually have one key advantage over Bonnie, which is that they culturally are taught to believe that any one of them can become the sun god. Bonnie was raised with the idea that Nika was an external force, someone who would eventually come and liberate you from your chains. So there were a few extra steps in getting Bonnie to awaken the Nika power for herself. But the end of the Elbaf arc could see every child on this island accessing the Gear 5th form and awakening like Bonnie did. Perhaps not physically themselves, but if Luffy is able to instill enough hope and joy into them, maybe through fighting and clowning on the nightmare creatures, then the nightmares of the children would vanish in the face of hope. And in their place, they could imagine each and every one of themselves becoming Nika, and then create an army of Nika to overwhelm the Holy Knights using their own ability. And there's some seeding for this already, as in chapter 1136, there is a very sneaky piece of art that a lot of people missed during the feast in the village, which is on this page, where at the very bottom you can see a Colin in the trademark Nika pose, perhaps foreshadowing that he's next to take on the sun god form. Oda doesn't just draw these things randomly, and I should also say that Oda purposely drew Loki in the other trademark Gear 5th pose as well in that very same chapter, so we have the potential for multiple sun god awakenings on Elbaf. If anyone was gonna do it first though, I currently most strongly believe in Colin. I would love it if he fell under the nightmare spell and had so much hope and spirit that he conjured a dream instead of him in the Nika form, which could go on to inspire the other children to see that in themselves. Or if not themselves, maybe the children could dream of their parents as sun gods. Yes, even that kid's mum could have a Nika form, and we would then have an army of fully grown sun godified giants for the Holy Knights to deal with. But look, why am I putting so much stock in Colin and the Elbaf children? It seems like a weird thing to focus on when we've got this wonderful shiny Loki right over there. But the reason why I'm focusing on the kids is because of Oda's focus and the legacy that he wants to leave on the world. In an interview with live action Luffy and Yaki Godoy, Oda was asked how he came up with Luffy, and the reply was, "Luffy is an ideal child for me. When you become an adult and join a company, you can't always do what you want. Entering society often means losing freedom. Luffy has a child's heart, so he does whatever he wants. That aspect is probably for adults already toiling in society, and to children about to enter society, what makes Luffy so appealing." So from the very beginning of One Piece, Oda has had a serious focus on the inherent freedom present within the mind of a child. And that's why Luffy has that mind which cannot ever be constrained or restrained. But it's also why Oda constantly chooses children to be the emotional focal points of his arc, especially post-time skip with Shirahoshi, Rebecca, Tama, Momonosuke, Jewelry Bonnie, and now Colin, as well as the rest of the kids on Elbaf. And Oda generally imparts part of Luffy onto these characters, usually in the form of an important lesson or mental fortitude. But starting with Bonnie, he is completely liberating them and turning them into the ideal children that he sees Luffy as. With Bonnie, I think this may be a response to Oda having two daughters. He's been drawing One Piece for almost 30 years, so he's grown and matured. And what we have to remember is that Oda is definitely someone who saw himself as Luffy when he first started drawing One Piece at almost the exact same age that Luffy was. As the earliest Luffy we have is the concept of Monkey D. Pow, drawn for a rejected manga called Forward in 1994 when Oda was 19 years old. And Luffy is now 19 years old in the One Piece world. However, Oda himself, back in reality, he has aged, he has matured, and now his focus is less on Luffy and more on the next generation. He knows that Luffy's story is coming to an end, but Oda wants to make sure that his spirit endures and leaves a mark on this world. So with Bonnie, I think that's a direct message to Oda's daughters that they are also capable of pursuing their dreams. And so on Elbaf, I think we may see that concept applied on a much wider scale with the children, and the message that everyone can achieve their dreams. Not easily, mind you. In both this and the case of Bonnie, it requires being able to fight through the nightmares, but it can be done. And I do think this will remain the overall trajectory of One Piece from here until the end of the series, especially considering that Blackbeard and Emu are both set up to be ultimate nightmares to overcome. Emu has long been thought to be a silhouette, but perhaps he is just a nightmare creature. Perhaps what we're seeing is just him. This is the true form of his power. Like the true form of Luffy's ability is a dream cartoon man that can't possibly exist in reality, even if it is fictional reality. And then Blackbeard is somehow somehow even more terrifying because he's very much the anti-Luffy, but also someone who is very capable of dipping into the same power source as Luffy. A man blessed by fate, fueled by dreams, and who himself has caused Luffy's biggest nightmares in the series by being responsible for capturing Ace. And with the abilities of a Darkness Logia, you'd better believe that everything we're seeing on Elbaf right now is gonna look very cute compared to the nightmare that Blackbeard brings to the sleep table, and that the final challenge to enact the dawn of the world will be to overcome the concept of darkness itself.